We're thrilled to be presenting a timely webinar brought to you by the ABA section of Civil Rights and Social Justice and the ABA Center for Human Rights, entitled Reconstructing and Deconstructing the Constitution, a conversation with scholar and author Aziz Rana. This is the second in a series exploring the Reconstruction era, which took place between 1865 and 1877, and its role in shaping civil rights, justice, and equality in the United States. Please stay tuned for additional details on other programs in the series in the coming months. CRSJ is actively planning additional programming on a variety of issues. Please feel free to visit theamericanbar.org /CRSJ for updates on these programs. During today's program, we encourage you to ask questions of our panelists through the Q&A feature, not the chat function. If you do not see the controls, please ensure that your screen is not idle. We will be monitoring the Q&A and we will do our best to address your questions, time permitting. A recording of this program will be shared with everyone who is registered, so please feel free to share it widely with your networks. My name is Etienne Toussaint, and I'll be your moderator today as we explore the structural tensions within the U.S. Constitution. We will examine our cultural relationship with this foundational document, and we'll consider the critical role of diverse voices in interpreting our Constitution and improving it. Our conversation today is especially timely as we confront the enduring legacies of our constitutional design, the shifting dynamics in politics on race, citizenship, and power, and the urgent need to reimagine how our legal frameworks can serve the ideals of justice and democracy. To help us navigate these complexities, we are honored to have two distinguished speakers. First, we have Barrett Holmes Pittner, who is a philosopher, journalist, educator, and author of the book, The Crime Without a Name, Ethnocide and the Erasure of Culture in America, which delves into the cultural underpinnings of American identity and the consequences of cultural erasure. And secondly, we have Professor Aziz Rana, who is the J. Donald Monin, S.J., University Professor of Law and Government at Boston College Law School, and most recently, author of The Constitutional Bind: How Americans Came to Idolize a Document That Fails Them. His work examines how evolving notions of race, citizenship, and empire have shaped legal and political identities since the nation's founding. Our goal today is not just to critique the Constitution, but to envision possibilities for transformation. We'll begin with some questions for our speakers, and then later we will open up the floor for audience participation. So without further ado, I'd like to begin our conversation by turning toward Professor Rana, who, if you don't mind, I'll call you Aziz. And the first question is about our political moment. Donald Trump has been president for 2 weeks, and America's civil rights community has been incredibly busy responding to his numerous executive orders. In this time of urgency, people are seeking new perspectives to understand this current political and legal climate. Your book, The Constitutional Bind, offers a bold and unique perspective on the U.S. Constitution and our relationship with it. What ideas do you have for us in this present crisis?
So first, thank you so much, Etienne, for that lovely introduction. Thank you to Barrett and Ali and everybody else at the American Bar Association for their work in putting on this event, as well as a series of other really important events. I'm honored to be able to participate in the discussion today. So the first thing that I'd say is that I think it's absolutely essential to just highlight the fact that we're now living through a profound assault on the basic principles of constitutionalism. And here I mean little c constitutionalism, presumptions about how you're supposed to organize a constitutional democracy based perhaps above all on the principle that no individual elected, let alone private folks of wealth, are supposed to be systematically above the law and able to reconstruct our institutions in keeping with their own whims. So we're living through an assault on the principles of little c constitutionalism. And that assault also goes hand in hand with an attack on some of the basic elements of the big C US federal constitution. in particular, the way in which Article 2 is structured, Article 1 dealing with Congress, Article 2 dealing with the executive. And I'd say across a whole range of issues highlighted by these executive orders, as well as by the activities of Elon Musk and those around him, that what we're effectively witnessing is dramatic forms of usurpatory illegality that, as a constitutional law professor, these are not even 50-50 questions or hard questions. The patent illegality is frankly quite obvious. We can talk a little bit about some of the specifics later on. And so it's both an attack on the principles of constitutionalism, any kind of constitutional system, and it's inconsistent with elements of our own existing constitutional text and structure. But this is where it gets a little bit more complicated, because what I would also argue, and this is elements of the book project, The Constitutional Bind, is that in many ways, our actual big C constitution, the nature of what Sandy Levinson and other scholars have called the Constitution of Settlement, the design structure, has effectively incentivized some of the outcomes that we're seeing at present. So it's not just that Trump and company are violating the Big C Constitution, but that we have a present state of affairs that is at least in part the product of the nature of how these institutions have been set up. And we can talk a little bit about how this plays out. And some of this stuff is quite familiar. So to begin with, we have a system of electoral representation organized through our constitutional apparatus that is not premised on the principle of one person, one vote, but instead highly emphasizes state-based and geographic representation in ways that end up having massive impacts through gerrymandering for the House, through representation in the Senate, through the Electoral College, through the Supreme Court and the federal courts in terms of the nomination process, through the difficulty of amending the Constitution. The US Constitution is understood as perhaps the hardest constitution in the world to amend. All of this has at the same time made it very easy for what amounts to a minoritarian tendency within the terms of American political life to be able to claim the institutions of government. You can see this through winning the presidency without winning the popular vote in 2016, reconstructing the nature of the federal courts, despite the fact that, let's say, a substantial number of the justices that have been appointed to the Supreme Court were appointed by presidents that lost the popular vote. And then through reshaping the nature of both legislative and presidential power through these kinds of practices. And then at some moments in time, because of profound disaffection with the nature of the institutions, being able to even win bare majorities and then further entrench these kinds of political practices. So that we've reached this state of affairs because, in part, of the nature of the electoral system that's established through our Constitution of Settlement. But it's not just that. It's also the case that over the course of the last century, the primary way to address effectively the problems of our constitutional system, its minoritarian dimensions, the difficulty of it being able to actually express large-scale popular majorities, has been through a workaround based on presidential power, the emergence and grafting of a system of strong presidential authority onto the constitutional apparatus. And one of the effects of that is that presidential power has not proven particularly effective at long-term lawmaking, because presidencies go back and forth. But it has proven quite effective at exercising the apparatus of what we can think of as the security state, engaging in various forms of discretionary, oftentimes coercive power overseas, at the border with respect to issues of immigration. And in a way, this moment, with the consolidation of an extreme version of presidential power that stands behind the rise of Trump, speaks to both of these embedded problems within the constitutional system. Its minoritarian tendencies that have elevated effectively folks like Trump into positions of power, and at the same time, a system of creeping presidential authority, especially through the exercise of violence and coercion, that's now also being metastasized, not just overseas, but effectively in lots of different vectors of American life. And it tells us something that I also think is really significant about enduring features of the American constitutional system that have to be recognized and engaged with. And this is the fact that if we were to tell the story of the collapse of Reconstruction, if we were to tell the story later on, more recently, of the response to, for instance, the attacks in January 2021, or even what we're seeing right now, that we both have lawlessness that is in violation of little c constitutionalism and the big C constitutional text. Lawless. But lawlessness that is essentially facilitated, made possible by the nature of the constitutional settlement, and is inhibited from being addressed by the structure of the institutions. In other words, a significant reason why post-Reconstruction, or even after the attack at the Capitol in 2021, the effort to subvert the election of 2020, that there were effectively no consequences for folks in some of the most senior positions of power because of the very difficulty of the constitutional system in being able to hold folks in positions of power accountable. The problems of the impeachment process. You can name a whole variety of other features of our constitutional structure. And that effectively we now find ourselves in a position in which the constitutional system as a whole has both facilitated acts of lawlessness and then created a culture of impunity around those acts, so that now you have an emboldened political leadership that's engaged in truly systematic forms of violation that both compromise little c constitutionalism and the big C Constitution. And what does that mean for the present? It means that it's imperative to recognize and call out all the forms of illegality that we are witnessing, including violations of the constitutional text, while at the same time realizing that truly the only way to get outside of this bind will be through some kind of democratically legitimate process for, in fact, transforming key elements of our constitutional system to make them more compatible with basic principles of constitutional democracy. And indeed, to learn the lesson, perhaps, from experiments in constitutional change that we see overseas, whose primary purpose, in a deep sense, in a variety of different locations, was to ensure against the usurpation of popular and legitimate democratic authority by various kinds of extreme individuals operating without regard to basic principles of democracy. So we're in this very specific bind that's both a violation of constitutional principles and a product of the big C Constitution. And in a way, and this is where I'll end, that this bind has been something that's hard for many folks that are on the center left to wrap their minds around. Because on the one hand, there's this recognition that the Constitution is the problem. Like, the Constitution is part of the reason why we see these developments. Yet on the other hand, there's this deep sense that believing in constitutionalism is a salvation. And yet there's this close approximation between believing in constitutionalism and having a kind of venerative, worshipful relationship to the big C Constitution. And teasing these things apart, recognizing that you can have an account of constitutionalism that respects the need to preserve elements of our existing system, to defend text from usurpations by individuals acting in ways that are discretionary and outside basic presumptions of democratic accountability, is key, while realizing that you need to build a kind of transformative and durable majority to actually pursue meaningful changes so that the system as a whole is actually consistent with the basic principles one holds.
I love that. Thank you so much for providing those insights. When you talked about the enduring features of the American system that produces the lawlessness that we see and the centrality of the Constitution in enabling that type of lawlessness, it made me think of William Lloyd Garrison and his argument that the Constitution is a pact with the devil. And I think that's part of our challenge today, to try to figure out, is in fact the Constitution doomed, or, as you kind of allude to, there's some way out. And the Reconstruction moment gives us some insights there. I want to turn to Barrett your book, The Crime Without a Name, similarly asks us to look through history and to gain some insights on our current moment. It's bold, it's unique. And so I want to throw the same question to you. What insights does your work have for our understanding of the current political and legal climate that we find ourselves in?
Well, thank you. And first off, I just want to say that it's an honor to be here with both of you. And I met Aziz last year at a talk at Harvard, and it was obvious to me that like I needed to have him talk in this series. And it's already quite evident that that was a very, very good decision. And so I'd say first off, like when I look at with my work, I talk about this term ethnocide, which is the destruction of people's culture while keeping the people. And I use that term to describe the transatlantic slave trade because that was the goal. The goal for colonizers was to destroy African culture, sever African people from their language, their food, their clothes, their communities, their families. And by destroying that culture, they felt they could create a mass of people that they could oppress in perpetuity and then build a society upon that. And that society they would claim to be a democracy. And when you don't have the precise language to describe an atrocity that was foundational for your society, it makes it much harder for you to clearly understand, see, or articulate the place with which you live. And that makes it even harder to even imagine what solutions could be because the problem hasn't been adequately identified. And so, you know, as someone who's not a lawyer, who's a philosopher, who's thinking about it in a philosophical way, there's a need to collaborate with lawyers and all sorts of people to come up with solutions for the many crises that we have. And so when I look at American society, I see a tipping point where there's this era of Reconstruction where we tried to make a democracy without ethnocide baked into it. To use like Rana's language, we could say that the abolitionists had a desire for like they understood small c constitutionalism. And upon winning the Civil War, the goal was to apply small c constitutionalism at a big C level, to redo American society in the Constitution, where like one person, one vote, African Americans had citizenship, African Americans could vote, and it was a process where it's not like you're going to accomplish everything in 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, but if we can continue this work in this direction, then we can apply more small c at a big C level. And when I see that era, you think of the 1960s, 50s, civil rights movement, a lot of the motivation, inspiration for that era came from Reconstruction. You can see a lot of the narrative of Barack Obama being a process of the civil rights era, which therefore is a process of Reconstruction. It made me think in a historical sense that many people on the American left, without being fully aware, were trying to continue the process of Reconstruction. We just didn't have the language to clearly articulate it so that we could even adequately converse one another to collaborate and make the progress that we felt inside. At the same time, there were clear American voices that wanted to oppose Reconstruction, just like the voices that wanted to oppose the civil rights movement in the 60s and 70s and also wanted to oppose Obama's presidency. Those people linguistically would fall under the language of the people who opposed Reconstruction, which back then they called themselves the Redeemers because they wanted to redeem the South to make it how it was before. I think this is this vital tipping point where there's this small c, large C constitution. And America needs to realize that we've engaged in this battle since the beginning of America. And this constitutional crisis right now that we're having is in many ways the people trying to undermine the transition of small c constitutionalism into large C. They're trying to prevent that from happening because they want the lawlessness that was baked into big C to be an ever-present, pardon the pun, trump card that they can use to get their way. And that's kind of what we're confronting now, where there's this destruction of the ideals and principles of Reconstruction and the implementation of the ideals of these redeemers. And the era that they created is called redemption, but it's more like a regression. Like that's what's happening right now. And so we need to have proper language and historical awareness to know that this is what's going on. Because if you just really think about it, Reconstruction was profound. The amount of people that were enfranchised and had citizenship and the structures that were created. The Justice Department was created during Reconstruction so that they could ensure that the civil rights of African Americans was being exercised and the civil rights of all Americans. But due to the violent lawlessness of white militias such as the Ku Klux Klan, it became evident that giving Black people rights on paper did not ensure that they were going to have the capacity to execute them. And so now the Justice Department needed to be created so they could go into states and ensure that the laws that they had on paper, they had the protections that they could execute it, where they could trump and defeat the lawlessness that was undermining constitutional principles. Like this is significant. And so the erosion of these departments that provide massive federal protections and try to create a standard of living that had prioritizes equality over lawlessness and division. Like this is a battle that we've already had. And when it happened before in the 1800s, we woke up and 20 years after the end of Reconstruction, separate but equal became the law of the land. Plessy v. Ferguson. And then we wake up and now there's Jim Crow segregation and all the immense progress of that era. Much of it had been undone, and the era of Reconstruction had been branded as a colossal failure that we should not look towards for inspiration. And I think that this cycle of erasure and branding, where good things become bad things and bad things become good things, we are in that era again. And we need to be aware of that so that we can ensure that constitutionalism at a small c level goes into the big C and we can, live as democratically, as fairly, as equally as we can.
Yeah, I appreciate your focus on culture, this concept of ethnocide, destroying culture and keeping the people is a fascinating one. And it dovetails nicely with something that I think Aziz is wrestling with in his work, which is the culture that sits at the root of our Constitution, right? What foundational values, principles, ideals do we grab hold to define who we are as a people who constitute ourselves as a liberal republic? And it's fascinating to think about the concept of culture in our current moment when President Trump, campaigns on a theme of Make America Great Again, and yet we see dramatic changes to the structure of government. And so there does now emerge a question: how does this question of culture shape these conversations that we're having right now? Aziz, in your book, you introduced the concept of Creedal constitutionalism, which explains an unhealthy relationship that we have with the Constitution, and that might give us some insights for why things have gotten to the point that we see them now, or perhaps some insights on pathways forward. I wonder if you could elaborate and introduce us to that term and how it might connect to some of this conversation that we're having.
Yeah, absolutely. So I use the term creedal constitutionalism as a way of articulating the dominant relationship to the Constitution that really emerges over the course of the 20th century. And in a way, if we just think about it intuitively, I'm sort of imagining the form of constitutional support that would have been commonplace if you went to public school in the US in the latter part of the 20th century, the beginning of this one, if you listen to politicians in the second half of the 20th century talk about the Constitution. And it's really a combination of a series of different ideological commitments. So there's support for the Constitution, but it's tied to the idea that the Constitution fulfills the principles of the Declaration of Independence, and in particular, ideas of universal equality. So that's the notion of the creed. That oftentimes goes back to Frederick Douglass and Lincoln, but it's oftentimes connected to the Swedish sociologist Gunnar Myrdal, his book from the 40s that many African-American social scientists were also central in doing the work for, called The American Dilemma, where he talks about an American creed as being the dominant national ideology and the general trend or direction of American history. Those two then are also connected in American life to an account of civil liberties, which is that supporting the Constitution, supporting creedal equality is tied to a belief that individuals in the US, especially through things like the Bill of Rights, are supposed to be free from the kinds of state interventions that marked totalitarian societies, freedom of speech, freedom of worship, etc. And at the same time, this vision of civil liberty is tied in its own way to economic liberty, that property rights and, let's say, civil liberty protections are both protections from an overweening form of state authority. There's space for economic regulation, but with a bedrock assumption of the country is organized through some version of market capitalism. And then all of that is tied to an account of representative government that's nonetheless constrained, organized through checks and balances, and that has a very strong space for the Supreme Court, like an insulated Supreme Court as perhaps the dominant articulator of constitutional meaning. And all of this is therefore then tied to an account of why, especially in the context of the Cold War and confrontations with the Soviet Union, after World War II and the confrontation with Nazi Germany, the US can be thought of as exceptional, as a place where a near ideal form of liberal democracy came down to earth, and that this exceptionalism then justifies American global primacy, why the US should be understood as well as like the first among equals on the global stage, and indeed enjoying a kind of international police power, perhaps to reconstruct the relationships that exist internal to other societies. I just want to note something about this story that I've told, which is in American life, this is a kind of cohesive ideology of what it means to be American, of how the Constitution fits within basic assumptions about national identity. But none of the elements of it necessarily have to go together. And indeed, at various points in American history, you had folks that were creedalists, but opposed to the Constitution. You invoked somebody like Garrison or Phillips, like they were radical abolitionists that believed to fulfill the principles of the Declaration, you're going to have to break from the Constitution. You have creedal constitutionalists, take somebody like Frederick Douglass, who sees the two as linked, but would have been suspicious of some of the other elements. And you can go on and on. But what happens in the US over the course of the 20th century is that all of these disparate components become fused together into a single narrative of what it means to be American, such that it's just part of the drinking water of what it meant to grow up. It's also important to highlight how this is a different story of why you support the Constitution than what would have been common in the mid part of the 19th century, where the Constitution was oftentimes thought of as a kind of compromise between North and South, including over the question of slavery. That compromise is the very opposite of what we would hold firm as worth venerating in the present. You don't compromise over some of the most profound evils in thinking about what's worthy of the system as a whole. And so there's this profound transformation in the cultural identification of the Constitution with a set of political and legal commitments. And I just want to say that this transformation is truly like maybe the great achievement of the US in the 20th century. It's part of the background by which you get the civil rights movement. You get various kinds of reform possibilities. And so I don't want to be understood as saying any version of creedal constitutionalism or any version of this official story is necessarily to be repudiated. Instead, I want to highlight how one of the deleterious effects of the process by which this became consolidated as how Americans think and talk about themselves and their Constitution was to essentially paper over open debates that existed in the late 19th, early 20th century in the context of the collapse of Reconstruction and the context of profound labor disputes between business and workers over that Constitution of settlement, the problems with the structure of the US constitutional system, and the difficulties of that structure in actually being an effective base for mobilizing a multiracial democracy committed genuinely to rights for all. And in a sense, I think what we're witnessing right now at present is the fact that the failure to come to grips with these structural components of the constitutional system is essentially rearing its head again. And it's doing so because, in many ways, the consolidation of this theory of national identity and of constitutional meaning was itself a contingent product of political developments, both domestic and foreign, that shaped American life between the 30s and the 60s. We can talk a little bit more about how this was centrally tied to the US's role on the global stage, and that what we have witnessed systematically, really since the end of the 80s, the last 30 years of the collapse of the Soviet Union, the end of the Cold War, is the breakdown of all of the elements of American economic, cultural, and political life that forged and sustained Creedal constitutionalism as both culturally dominant and shaping how political elites think and talk about their own institutions. And we're living in a moment where effectively one of the things I think we are witnessing is that the portion of the political right that is now ascendant within, say, the Trump coalition is a portion that pretty systematically is defecting too from elements of that Creedal constitutional story. And yet we're stuck with the consequences of the limitations of that account as a way of safeguarding us against some of the worst features of American life that existed before, let's say, the rise and consolidation of Creedal constitutionalism. And that essentially is the problem of the present, which is to recognize the achievements of the mid-20th century, to understand how those achievements nonetheless failed to address profound problems that are rearing their head again, and also to confront an emboldened right that is essentially rejecting not just that compact, but in a profound sense, the achievements that are worth venerating about what the US was able to accomplish over the last century.
And certainly the extent to which the current administration continues to advocate for banning certain aspects of history in schools, at least told through a specific lens, I think continues to make it challenging to come to grips, as you kind of describe, the settlements, the aspects of history that have led to the bind, as you describe it today. In this series, we're focused on trying to tease out the role of the Reconstruction era and helping us to come to terms with what some of those early settlements were and what we can learn from that moment. So I wanted to turn back to Barrett for a moment. You've been intimately involved in kickstarting this project called the Reconstructionism Project, which argues just that the Reconstruction era should play a significant role in how Americans understand and relate to the Constitution today. And I can see the connections between that very statement and what Aziz has been saying. So I wonder if you might share, how do you see this analysis, this positioning of the Reconstruction moment in our current political moment? How do you see that aligning with, reinforcing, or contrasting with the perspective that Aziz has shared?
So I agree with Aziz's analysis 100%. And at a philosophical level, I see it as a dialectical dilemma, where like if we're talking about dialectics and when we talk philosophically, it becomes like really abstract, but like a dialectic is just like a dialogue or a relationship. Like we engage in dialogues and have dialectics with people at a micro level, at a macro level. We have them with like animals and the environment. It's just the relationship we have with everything. And one thing that I've noticed, and this isn't just for the United States, but I think it's something that like impacts Western civilization, is that when there's this dialogue, there's always a place that resides for something that's beyond existence, that has like a pure manifestation of goodness or knowledge. And we're supposed to have that like descend down to us. So like the veneration of the Constitution is an idea where like the Constitution is this divine good thing that's here over here, and it just like shines down, and we are almost exist as derivatives of that thing. And our goal is just to cherish and venerate it. And that will result in a good outcome because that thing is good in some sort of pure sense. I think this place that we hold for this like divine purity beyond existence, and this goes back to Plato's forms. So we're talking like, BC here, actually corrupts our dialogues and it corrupts our dialectic because what it demands is that for someone to be legitimate, you also have to agree that the goodness derives from that thing. So now we have a dialogue where the premise is that we have to agree before we can discuss. And if someone disagrees, they then become the other. And the goal then becomes to eliminate the other or minimize the other because they don't have the goodness that comes from here. And I think this notion influences our relationship with the Constitution, where, if you're on the left, you'll venerate it in one way. If you're on the right, you'll venerate it in the other way. And what this does is it undermines dialogue, which is essential for a democracy to exist. Like you have to be able to engage in discourse with your representatives. Your representatives have to be able to engage in discourse in Congress, and you have to come together to create things that create like experiential goods for the people in the site, good outcomes that we experience, that we live, not theoretical goods that we imagine are somehow pure and untainted by life. If you undermine that, you're going to undermine and devour your own democracy. And so one of the fascinating things here is this notion of this divinity, whether it's a secular or religious one that resides beyond existence, it corrupts everything. And it also inclines us to gloss over and minimize the flaws that we see and the discussions that can come out of them to remedy those problems. Because if we see the flaws, then the purity is gone. And if the purity is gone, then all goodness is gone. And if we are trying to exist as derivatives of that goodness, we are now questioning our capacity to actually make good things. And that's a very, very profound problem. I think Reconstruction, without having this philosophical language, tried to have that dialectical shift where they were trying to implement policies and amend the Constitution in ways that would have an experiential good outcome for African Americans and create an outcome that was good for African Americans that didn't put African Americans above anybody, but allowed them to live equally amongst white people in America. This shift is profound at a philosophical level. And I think like to go how to Aziz articulated at his opening remarks, that's like a small c constitutionalism that we're trying to make it at a big C level, where we're building our society around the capacity to have dialogue, where no one has some divine notion of purity that trumps everything else, that usurps our humanity. That's the real crisis. And once we started to negate and dismiss the significance of Reconstruction, I think our society regressed back to that theoretical good, where we're just derivatives of that type of good. You could even say that the constitutional theory of originalism is based around that idea where like the purity, the goodness of America derives from the origin, and it's just our job to be derivatives who interpret that and implement that. But we're not people who are capable of creating actual goods, good experiences that matter for people's lives. We're just people that are derivatives of people who lived hundreds of years ago. And so this crisis, I think, impacts the left and the right. And the American left, in many ways, has thrived by trying to transcend that flaw. And we've struggled and regressed by not attempting, via our attempts to not transcend that. And I think Aziz's Creedal constitutionalism does a very good job of pointing out the dynamics of that. And so I think we see a line very similarly, despite having completely different disciplines.
So I appreciate those remarks. I want to tease out a little bit more the Reconstruction moment. Um, it's very interesting as you're talking, Barrett, discussing it from a philosophical lens, talking about divinity and a concept of goodness that we as a society seek to constitute ourselves around and order our lives around a abstract, maybe quote unquote natural idea of goodness. Um, Aziz has similar like rhetoric, even in your title, right? You use the word idolize, this idea of to idolize, to worship. There's sort of a divine nature associated with the relationship between people and the Constitution. And on the one hand, maybe this helps to better clarify what you mean and what we mean when we've been saying small c Constitution, right? Like, and one question I'd ask to Aziz is to maybe clarify what you really mean by small c Constitution. Does it connect that notion of a people constituting themselves around a shared set of ideas that has a connection to a sort of natural or divine understanding of what it means to be a full human who flourishes and who thrives. Um, but then connected to that, I really want to hone in on the Reconstruction moment because one could make an argument that the United States has been trying to realize this aspect of goodness since the founding, right? They've been trying to realize the creed since the founding, and Reconstruction is just another moment of trying to realize and starting and failing, starting and failing. Or is Reconstruction a pivotal moment, a shift, is something different happening? And in your book, Aziz, you don't really start in the Reconstruction era, even though you make some reference to it. So I'm curious, what your thoughts are on that.
So maybe a thought on Reconstruction and then teasing out what I mean by constitutionalism. So, my view about Reconstruction is probably pretty consistent with Barrett's, which is that the Reconstruction period, if we're thinking about eras of American life to venerate, figures to venerate and draw lessons from, I think that Reconstruction should hold really pride of place because it's the most sustained effort really in American history to genuinely like transform the nature of American institutions, race relations, as well as judgments about who holds economic and political sovereignty in the country to produce something like a multiracial democracy that connects the electoral process to the underlying terms of who wields economic power, who has access to things like land, who has opportunities of education. So this is like a tremendous period that also is a tremendous period of achievement that I think historically was systematically papered over in terms of what Reconstruction figures were able to pursue as part of a genuine shift in the meaning of the American project. But for the purposes of my own book, I end up essentially, though I spend some time with the 19th century and a little bit with Reconstruction, starting my story in the 1880s. And I do so for both an historical, kind of like academic scholarly reason, but then also, let's say, for a kind of conceptual, normative political reason. The historical, academic, scholarly reason is that oftentimes the most common way of telling the story about American constitutional change is to essentially highlight the Constitution as a product of very specific moments. So the founding, move from the Articles of Confederation to the Federal Constitution, Civil War and Reconstruction, New Deal, and the Civil Rights Movement. This tendency does two things. First, the story is almost entirely internal. So constitutional change in the US and the development of constitutional meaning, so the rise of a coherent 20th century constitutional culture is just an internal domestic story. And it also has this quality that Etienne, you were hinting at, which is there's a kind of ineluctable dimension to it, which the US almost out of necessity was going to become the nation that emerges in the 20th century, or that creedal constitutionalism is just an inherent outgrowth of the terms of American life. And I wanted to contest that historically by highlighting how that if actually we went back to the late 19th century, this is a period in which, yes, creedal ideas are the product of anti-slavery politics, have a moment of ascension during Reconstruction, but are systematically pushed back. And if anything, the dominant approach to race is still one in which there's a presumption that the country is effectively a white republic. And indeed, you have folks like Teddy Roosevelt, who's sending parts of the Pacific Fleet on a tour of Australia and New Zealand following Japan's victory against Russia in the war in 1904, 1905 to highlight how, just like the US, these other places will be thought of too as white man's country. I mean, so the ideas one would associate with Frederick Douglass are relatively marginal positions within the terms of mainstream white American society. And so that requires having an alternative account of how is it that those ideas, creedal constitutionalism, and indeed these are understood as quite threatening because they might disrupt. In fact, that's part of the project of Reconstruction. Who has sovereign power? Who enjoys meaningful control? Whether or not the country should be a multiracial democracy. Actually getting to the 20th century story requires a different narrative that's not just the familiar one that's been presented. And to me, this is where the international fits in. You can't, it's not the only explanation, but you cannot tell the story of the 20th century rise of American constitutional culture without connecting it to the profound changes that are taking place in the global context and the fact that constitutional development is taking place alongside the rise of the US to global superpower status at a very particular historical moment, which is over the course of the first 2/3 of the 20th century, the European imperial system collapsing because of two massive world wars and systematic global decolonization against the backdrop of the Cold War. And that the decolonization of the global community at a time when the US is asserting more and more power on the international stage ends up reshaping the terms by which Americans justify their international authority. And it leads political elites in both parties to reclaim elements of the old anti-slavery creedal story as part of how to articulate the US's new place. And then that also ends up having all of these rippling effects, not just for the international system, but for how American reform politics operates internally. So I feel like this is the reason why I start the book after Reconstruction. And then I think there's a kind of normative or political reason, which is to contest the presumption of the ineluctability of what we would think of as kind of Cold War official creedal liberalism. In truth, one of the things that we're seeing at present right now is the revival of a very powerful version of what amounts to a combination of white nationalism and economic populism. If you think of the creedal story as just the ineluctable progression of American ideas that's inevitable, it's strange to see something like this so return with such prominence within pockets of the American public. But if you recognize that actually, in many ways, some combination of white nationalism and economic populism throughout large chunks of American history was perhaps the dominant ideological formation. You can see it Jefferson and Jackson all the way to folks like George Wallace. Then, in a way, what we're navigating in the present is the breakdown of a particular ideological form that shaped the 20th century. And it requires us to see how the politics, so maybe this is a kind of continuity with Barrett, like the politics of the late 19th, early 20th century, in many ways is like an important kind of parallel. So the history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. It's an important parallel to think about what we're confronting at the present. We're in a historical moment that has all of these continuities with the forms of antagonism, polarization, ideological pluralism for good and truly for bad that marked America before the consolidation in the mid 20th century. And then this gets to the point about little c constitutionalism. So, one of the accusations that's placed against people that highlight the flaws with our constitutional system is to say that you're just against the idea of having constitutions, or you're against the idea of having any approach to something like the rule of law. And I reject that because, in a way, a function of the 20th century story is to make it appear to Americans as if there is only one model for having the constitutional order, and it's the version of constitutional politics that became dominant here in the mid-century, where instead there are like many ways of imagining constitutionalism, and including many different kinds of experiments that we've seen globally and also domestically with different social movements, from Black politics to feminist politics to labor politics to indigenous politics. And that if the core, in my view, is a vision of the law that's wedded to an account of multiracial democracy, and that is also predicated on an account of rights, that itself has the possibility for individuals to enjoy something like equal and effective freedom over all of the sites of their own collective decision making, whether political, economic, or social, that you can have different kinds of systems of constitutional arrangement that fit with those basic principles. And in a way, I think the struggle of the present is not unlike the struggle at Reconstruction. It's not unlike the struggle for labor activists and Black activists in the early part of the 20th century. It's not unlike the debates that percolated in American life in the 60s and the 70s. And that's, can you genuinely have a system that links multiracial democracy to support for the kinds of rights that protect individuals to an account of equal and effective freedom for all, so that you do not have large pockets of collective life dominated or dictated by a small subset of individuals that enjoy overweening authority. And so that's what we're dealing with today, but in a kind of hyperdrive because of the consequences of like the breakdown of the mid-century compact.
I'm trying to make sure I understand um, a point that you raised, Aziz. So I just want to ask you to clarify. It sounded like you were saying white nationalism, as we see it today, there has been some version of that consistently present in U.S. politics across United States history. And I don't think that's difficult for people to agree with. But that fact contests the presumption that our country is inevitably going to be a liberal country that reflects these foundational principles or values, this creed. And so I guess my question, to just ask you to clarify, because you identify in a small c constitutional context different articulations at the local level of how people might constitute themselves and choose to organize their lives. Is what we're seeing a reflection of one group and their voice becoming dominant historically as a byproduct of a democratic process, or is this an intentional manipulation of the constitutional process to ensure that those other experiments that you've mentioned remain out of the dominant discourse? Talk about feminist politics and Black politics, right? And that we see historically white nationalist politics sort of, but is that an intentional byproduct of manipulating the Constitution? And is that the bind, or is the bind that the Constitution makes it difficult for these different groups to have their voices heard?
Yeah, no, so that's a great question. So the thing that I would say is that if you look at the long array of American history, that some combination of what we can think of as like white nationalist politics or ethno-nationalist politics alongside some account of economic populism that emphasizes, local control for farmers, artisans. Sometimes scholars talk about this as a type of populist or small d producerist democracy. That combination has been a very powerful political formation. And, there's an open question about whether or not it's been a majority formation because of the fact that through large chunks of American history, it's also the case that folks are systematically disenfranchised. But so, like, within the terms of who's allowed to vote uh, during the Jacksonian period of the early 19th century, that's a dominant political formation. And the thing, in a way, that's distinctive about the mid 20th century is that for a variety of domestic and international reasons, there's the New Deal politics and labor politics, the kind of coalition that's built around FDR. There's World War II and the confrontation with Nazi Germany and the ways in which anti-racism becomes central to the confrontation with a genocidal Nazi project. And then there's the terms of the Cold War, which brings left and right closer together around the need, especially to win hearts and minds in the global South, to pursue desegregation, to uproot Jim Crow. All of these features create a context in which, even on the right, there's pressure essentially to excise various forms of explicit white supremacy and explicitly white nationalist politics as outside the bounds. And what that does is it creates a kind of political compact that operated until quite recently, where that combination of white nationalism and economic populism really doesn't have a home within the political parties. And in a sense, I think what we've seen more recently, especially with the breakdown of the Cold War period, is the return of that ideological formation as something that has political expression here explicitly within the Republican Party. And that is, again, on the political stage. I'd say on the left, this is also tied to you have the revival of socialism too, democratic forms of socialism, Bernie Sanders, others that are forms of political identity and organizing that were quite common in the US, especially before the Cold War. But it's produced a situation where there is a subset of the polity that is committed to these ideas, that has a lineage going back, frankly, to the founding. And here's where the constitutional system comes into play, which is, I do not believe that this subset actually expresses an American political majority or a durable American political majority. But I do believe that the nature of the constitutional system, in particular, the focus on state-based representation, the ways in which this plays out with gerrymandering, how this shapes the Senate, how this affects the Electoral College, who ends up on the Supreme Court, how it intersects with the incentive structures for the political parties, and in particular here we're talking about the Republican Party. What it does is, on the one hand, it feeds an electoral incentive within the Republican Party to view multiracial democracy as an almost existential threat. And it also dramatically elevates the political authority voice of folks that are part of this far-right coalition. So that by claiming the party, by taking advantage of the nature of our electoral system, you can have a contemporary state of affairs where, even in this off chance where Trump wins like a bare majority, you have policy that's being dictated by a perspective that's back on the stage, but that's a relatively speaking, minoritarian perspective. And that's a huge problem about how American culture and American institutions are interacting. And it's one that I think you could say has all sorts of echoes with what happens during Reconstruction and after Reconstruction, with politics in the 20s and 30s, with politics even during the era of slavery, and that we're seeing at present again.
Interesting. And so if I understand what you're saying correctly, if in fact this rise of white nationalism that we see is a minority view, but that has been able to seize hold of power in significant ways. And perhaps, in fact, the Constitution is a pact with the devil, and we're going back to William Lloyd Garrison. But I want to turn to Barrett and let him jump in here, because I think what we're starting to allude to is the importance of taking stock and taking account of whose voice is prominent and visible within democratic discourse, within political discourse. And to be sure, the Reconstruction moment was a time period in which we had the introduction of the voice of Black Americans and others. So I want to invite Barrett to respond to some of what Aziz has shared, and also then transition us to talking a little bit more about Reconstruction, the value of having diverse voices entering into that dominant political discourse, and how that connects to what we see today, where there's some silencing of multicultural discourse. There are attempts to eliminate conversations about diversity, equity, inclusion, which connects to what kinds of conversations we're having politically. So how do you see these things connecting, Barrett?
So there's a lot to add here. But I'll start with you brought back that William Lord Garrison quote, and I want to just tell the audience how like the Greek word diabolos, which then became diablo and devil, like the origin of that word means the who divides. And so, in like a theological sense, the diabolos, the devil, was the person who would divide people from God, you know? But now we're talking in a framework by like dividing human beings from each other. And so it's really fascinating where like when you look at this diabolos, the who divides, and you attach it to like what you feel you need to be attached to as a person, where that's the role that the devil plays based off of like what attachments matter to live. And so like if we go and talk about the disproportionate influence of white supremacist voices, like linguistically and philosophically, we need to realize that the term like white supremacist was first coined in the early 1800s, and it was used as an expression by slave owners to articulate just the natural order of things, how they felt it was. So it was used not as like a negative statement in America. It was used as a statement to profess the necessity to divide white people from all the other people of society, of the world. And this also goes into the idea, this cultural idea, where if you're attached to something in the sky, that you now have like divine ideas flowing from you, that then that divides you from everybody else. The identity that you're going to give yourself, if it's not attached to place, is going to be attached to that idea. So the idea of white as an identity was something that was based off of being like a purity of existence that was untouched by a non-white existence. It's like a zero-sum identity. And so if you start trying to create a constitution where this division is like a philosophical foundation of it, you can see that there's already a corruptive influence in it from its inception. And you can see that in notions like the Three-Fifths Compromise, even the location of Washington, D.C. Because what we're saying at the beginning of America, like at the creation of the United States, Pennsylvania and Virginia had about the same amount of eligible white men voters. But Virginia dominated American politics because it had more seats in the House of Representatives and a more electoral college votes because three-fifths of the enslaved population could count for representation. And so this already put a minority of the population in the position of the majority. Like we have never had a president from Pennsylvania, but we've had many presidents from Virginia. And just the location of Washington, D.C. Like if the capital was in New York or Philadelphia and a Southerner became president, if they lived there and they're enslaved housekeepers, you know, the enslaved people they brought with them, lived in those states for a certain amount of time, they could be eligible to become free. So having DC located on the border would allow Virginians to be able to bring their enslaved people to the nation's capital to work in the White House, and then if they ever got close to that time limit where they could become free, they could just send them back to Virginia. And so this already shows this dynamic from the inception of giving, white people who proclaimed white supremacy as just the natural order of the world, a disproportionate influence in the shaping of our Constitution and American life. This then brings in this awareness of like diabolos and the division we're talking about. And so if you look at Reconstruction, this was an era where they tried to eliminate that division between Black and white people, which then would create a division from our veneration, our divine connection to the immaculate Constitution that was created by the founders. And so this is the tension of like, where do we need to divide from? And if we are divided from one, how do we make something good? And with Reconstruction, the idea was we're going to make something good and we'll know it's good because we'll see people's lives get better. Like we will see African American lives getting better because they're no longer enslaved. And the white people who interact with them could clearly notice that their lives were getting better because they would get perspectives of the world that they hadn't seen before. Like the numerous stories of Northerners who came to the South, who interact with Black people and just assume that there's going to be some profound level of ignorance, that the African Americans wouldn't be able to understand the Bible or organize or represent themselves or even contribute in it to discourse in an educational way. That was an assumption that happened. And then they interact with African Americans in the South and they realize that that wasn't the case at all. And that's why you see large amounts of African Americans winning representation in the House of Representatives. There was for a short period of time, there was a Black governor in Louisiana. There were Black senators. They became in these positions because they were comfortable collaborating with white Americans who could see their humanity and could see that all of our lives were getting better because we had this type of dialectic, this type of discourse, and we had broken away from a veneration of a divine document and had the confidence that by discourse and collaboration, we could make something better. I think when Aziz talks about the constitutions in other countries, he's giving examples of people believing that they could come together and make a new document that was better than the first one. And even if that document wasn't as good as they intended it to be, there's a belief that they could collaborate and make another one. This is just something that Americans don't want to believe that they're capable of doing. They want to believe that our obligation is to venerate the one that was created at the beginning, where we have to be attached to that, where we're intellectually, at best, derivatives of people from the 1700s. That's absurd, but that's what we profess all the time. And so I think when we look at Reconstruction, of course, there's a lot of accomplishments that we need to look at. But what we really need to look at is just this new way of seeing how we relate to each other and what our capabilities are, that we can come together in discourse and create something that's better than what preceded us. That doesn't mean that it's a complete negation. You take the good parts from what was it from before, you get rid of the bad parts, and you make something better. Like this is a dialectical process. And that's what we're talking about. I think one thing that's really fascinating about Aziz's work, and especially his book, which, just to be clear, his book is about 700 pages. If we were asking him to talk about our relationship to the Constitution that encompassed the beginning of America all the way through, we're talking about a 1,500 page book. I think he spent 10 years writing this book. We're talking like a 20-year investment. We should just be very pleased that we already have something of this depth and substance to look at half of the process. And the fact that half of the process is discussed and perceived in the absence of Reconstruction in many Americans' minds shows the capacity that our society has for erasing the good stuff that shaped us. Like the conversation that we're having right now, the three of us being on the screen, talking to each other, and people looking at us, believing that these people of color can have good ideas and they can be more than just derivatives of white guys from the 1700s is due to Reconstruction. That's massive. That's profound, and we have to be aware of that as we start coming up with bold ideas to change the dynamic. And this isn't a bold idea where we're erasing or negating any group of people. It's the bold idea that we're having equal conversations with other people with an awareness that we're creating an experiential good and not a theoretical good that we aspire to derive from. I'll say most of my work focuses on culture. Race is not really the topic because culture is the thing that created these racial constructs that we're trapped within. We have to think of the thing that like preceded that. We have to be like pre-racial in many ways. And when I brought this up in my book and I talked to people about ethnocide, it became very clear that a lot of ethnocidal things that America has done, we thought were good. But when you have the word ethnocide, it becomes evident that they're bad. And so I got feedback as I was going through the process that I needed to articulate what good was, which was like a profound question that I didn't anticipate having to ask at the beginning of the book. And then as I did more research, it became evident to me that in the Western mindset, good has always been a pursuit. It's always been a theoretical beyond. Like the word utopia doesn't mean good place. It means non-existent good place. The pursuit of happiness. That's not saying that America is a happy place. That's saying that you can pursue it. And if you believe that that pursuit is a guarantee, then now you're equating pursuing and possessing as if they're the same when they, without a doubt, aren't. And so we in this country have for a very long time spoken about as if we live in a good place because it derives from something good and we should be happy that we get to pursue good. But what we really should be focusing on is creating good. Reconstruction was about doing that. And if you're creating good in an experiential way, that goodness basically means something that's sustaining and nurturing. That's what good food is. That's what a good friend is. Those are things that sustain and nurture you. Perpetual division and lawlessness and a corrupted big C constitutionalism is neither sustainable or nurturing. And I think our tension since the inception of this nation has been the tension between like creating good and pursuing good. The creation, the tension between like an experiential good and an aspirational theoretical good. And as we confront bad things, we need to really think hard about creating good things. And I think Reconstruction helps us do that better.
Some of what's been coming out of this dialogue is, you know, beyond the claim that I think most of us agree with, that the Constitution reflects a kind of cultural dialogue and a cultural settlement on foundational principles and values, right? As Aziz references, this Creedal constitutionalism is a reflection of that cultural embrace of foundational principles across the long course of United States history. That the question of what these aspects of the creed mean for our everyday lives is very much contested. And as you noted, Barrett, even prior to Reconstruction, distinctions between the North and the South play that out. And those of us, familiar, even the concept of citizenship prior to the Reconstruction era debates was quite distinct among the various states in terms of what rights individuals had who had claims to citizenship, in so-called free states like Ohio, right? The free African Americans had limited citizenship rights. So there were distinctions even prior to the Reconstruction era on what the very concept of citizenship, this foundational principle, this reflection of foundational ideals means. And so that, I think, leads us to this question that's very important and one that's hotly contested today, which is how do you interpret a constitution, right? Even if this constitution is a reflection of a foundational creed. And in your work, Aziz, you reference others who have interpreted the Constitution who are not traditional legal or constitutional scholars, but that offer unique insights that we should pay attention to. I'm curious if you could speak a little bit to that, and then how does that relate to what we see happening today? The Supreme Court grabbing hold to analytical tools like originalism, and it's reviving again this question of who has the right to decide what the Constitution means in terms of those foundational values that you reference and how they are reflected and manifested in the language, the big C language of the text.
Yeah, thanks so much. So maybe I'll start with that last point about sort of invoking originalism. And that might also be an opportunity to respond to at least one of the questions that I saw in Q&A about how concretely did the mid-20th century story of creedal constitutionalism end up inhibiting the types of reform imagination that one could potentially pursue. So on originalism, I think it's really important, and this is not original to me, to distinguish between originalism as a methodology of interpretation among lawyers and originalism as a cultural force that has a broader political function. As a methodology, different forms of originalism can be pursued in ways that don't necessarily have a clear ideological valence, and there are internal differences. I mean, there's obviously like various kinds of critiques of originalism. So if you emphasize intent, there are big debates about, well, can you actually come up with a clear intent of a group rather than of individuals? If you emphasize original public meaning, or just like what the text would have been understood to mean to readers at a moment in time, there's always the issues of like the fact that the text itself is open-ended. And it's not clear that just knowing the public meaning will allow you to then be able to resolve problems in the present. So this is to say that there are methodological disputes about the viability of originalism as a tool that can be a clear and persuasive guide for lawyers. So that's all that stuff that's out there. But I actually think the more powerful role that originalism plays is not even as this methodological tool that judges, especially conservative judges, are claiming to use in the federal courts. It's the fact that it's closely tied to a way of thinking about constitutional life and American life. And here I actually think the rise of originalism as a cultural force, which really is a product in many ways of the 70s to the present, took place against a very specific backdrop. And that's the fact that in the mid-20th century, in the 40s and the 50s, folks that were broadly committed to a kind of liberal Cold War compact, that were creedal constitutionalists, supportive of racial reform, recovered their allegiance effectively to the framers. In the early part of the 20th century, even if you're thinking about New Deal lawyers in the 30s, they might be willing to say, okay, maybe we don't need to formally change the Constitution. But there's a lot of criticism about the basic elements of the constitutional system. And by extension, there's criticism of the framers themselves. Like, were the framers motivated by their own economic interests, as somebody like Charles Beard would say? Or even if they had the best of intentions, did they create a kind of misshapen system of representation that really doesn't fit with the needs of the public? And in particular, here you can think about the difficulty of amendment, the problems of effective legislation because of the difficulties of actually building something like a durable majority, the ways in which that ends up then careening into extensive powers for the executive, for the courts. There are all of these structural problems. But in the 40s and 50s, against the backdrop of the Cold War, these problems are swept under the rug, and they're instead oftentimes reclaimed as the thing that's actually worth defending. A strong Supreme Court, massive checks and balances, the difficulty of amendment. And once that's done, it goes hand in hand with recovering the framers as themselves proto-creedalists. So you have this development of referring to people like Madison, an enslaver, as somebody that's, a proto-creedalist because he created this system that eventually becomes a system that can overturn slavery or pursue different kinds of decisions under the Equal Protection Clause of the Reconstruction Amendments. And that kind of cultural recovery sets the terms for conservative reaction. There are lots of reasons why conservative legal figures, as well as the conservative movement in general, rally around originalism. There's a continuity between an originalist focus on like what the text would have meant at a particular moment in time and certain elements of Protestant, especially theology, so that there's a Christian nationalist component to this. But it's also the case that in a cultural context in which there's this broader revival of the framers, and an effort to read American history as a single continuous story from Jefferson and Madison enslavers all the way to the present, that it creates an opening for folks that are suspicious of the transformations in American life in the 60s, so the civil rights movement, the women's movement, you name it, to then say, well, if the framers created this ideal system and everything should go back to how they conceived of it, and even if the institutions were ideal and just, then maybe the way that we should answer all problems in the present is just by enacting what their will might have been. It might not be the case that doing that will produce an outcome that's consistent with the new right in every single case, but it's certainly the case that a culture that imagines that 20th and 21st century problems are best solved by returning to the will of 18th century individuals is one that's much more compatible with a broader reaction against those changes and transformations. And then I would say that like that's kind of led us to the present, where now what we're dealing with is, to the extent that elements of the right have been able to claim control over key institutions of government, you're seeing a push for restoration that even does away with originalism. That's like, well, you know, we want restoration to go back to an earlier era, but honestly, the stuff methodologically about like, does it really matter what the framers in fact intended or what the public meaning was, is now increasingly being contested. And so you have internal debates effectively within American conservatism that's still holding on to the kind of originalist story that in a way is responsive to or engaged with the kind of creedal compact from the mid 20th century, and then other folks that are just straightforward restorationists, in a sense, rejecting key elements of those achievements from the mid-century. And I think this state of affairs then requires us to really think seriously about the figures in American life that argued that in order to genuinely produce something like equal and effective freedom, the country was probably going to have to move beyond, in some systematic way, the existing constitutional infrastructure. And here I'm thinking of labor activists from the early 20th century, feminists like Crystal Eastman, great Black figures like W.E.B. Du Bois, for instance, in the 30s, was saying that the achievements of the New Deal were going to be curtailed because the country refused, and the political leadership refused to address what he called the national taboo of the states and the Senate. In other words, if you have an electoral system that's predicated not on the principle of one person, one vote, but on extreme geographical disparity, that this over time is going to undermine the capacity of having strong, durable, multiracial majorities that can actually instantiate the achievements of the New Deal. And in a deep way, I think his prognosis is what we're effectively coming to grips with now. And so it means that we might want to be thinking about the types of changes that were imagined then, providing alternative avenues for constitutional change besides the courts or like a strongman president through a simplified amendment process, improving our electoral system, dealing with how we organize the federal courts through various kinds of reforms to the courts, to a whole host of potential changes. And at the same time, also recognizing that the only way to pursue these changes is to build the internal institutional basis for constituencies to express their own commitments and forms of power. The reason why we had the New Deal achievements in the first place is because of a strong labor movement that was able to provide the FDR with supermajorities to overcome the blocks that existed in the country. And right now, in a context of profound attacks inside and outside the federal government on labor, we can think of the importance of labor as another intermediate institution that needs to be built so as to be able to house a politics that can pursue these kinds of changes.
I want to transition us to looking at some of the questions that our audience members have provided in the Q&A so that we can have a chance to respond to some of those. And the first one I think is really fascinating. It speaks to the question of the extent to which the Constitution is a reflection of the people's will, or is the Constitution something that is connected to a broader moral conception of good, right? So there's a philosophical and political aspect. This question says, do you feel the entire moral legitimacy of our constitutional government rest on one person, one vote democracy? What other aspects of our constitutional structure, if any, might provide moral legitimacy? And I'm mindful that President Donald Trump, right, claimed that he won the popular vote, that America wanted him, that they wanted the program that he's providing, right? And so to the extent that you have an administration that, you know, has the majority vote, does that lend moral legitimacy in a democratic state, or is there something more? It kind of dovetails, I think, to some of what Barrett said. Some of those questions about goodness, morality is kind of urging us to think about this broader principle, philosophical conception of goodness. So what do you all think?
Yeah, I'll jump in real quick. It's a very profound question because our society, I feel like Western civilization has always tried to make morality or ethics some sort of pure, divine, absolute thing that like precedes our connection with one another, where there's you embody it, you exude something, you have power that bestows it upon you, and it's a thing that exists in the abstract and not based on like how you treat other people or how good or sustainable or nurturing you are as a person. And so when we're talking about like the morality of our Constitution, where one person, one vote, like the morality comes from people seeing each other as people and understanding that we need to have a dialogue, a dialectic, where we get to express ourselves in a way that we should understand exists to sustain and nurture each other. I think that's like a foundational idea of democracy that we just like gloss over and don't really ever talk about, and then talk about morality without articulating like the frameworks that create it, where then it becomes some sort of abstraction that like comes down like upon us and then like compels us to be moral, or we act moral because we're fearful of like what would happen otherwise. And this creates like some like oppressive, divisive concept of morality or ethics, where it's existing in the abstract and not based off of our interaction with other people. And so I think we think about it inverted. I think about we see it backwards, and then we get shocked and traumatized when someone actually expresses our concept of morality in a way that's not inverted, where they're saying this morality is basically just power dynamics. And if I have a position of authority that's supposed to like come with morality, if I take that position by whatever means, you now have a moral obligation to view me as a moral, good, ethical person, regardless of my actions, where the morality precedes my actions and my relationships and connections to other people. I think that's the dynamic where we see ourselves. And I think, the American right consistently plays this card, and you can see the left responding where they're saying like the people that they're appointing are unqualified. They don't have the stuff that they should have to be able to adequately do this job. And their response is, it doesn't matter. Once they have that job, you have a moral responsibility to treat them as if they do have the qualifications, as if they will do a good job. And that's, so you really have to have a very deep philosophical conversation about changing this dynamic where it leaves the theoretical and goes more into the experiential. And democracy is all about experience. The whole framework is about experiencing a freedom that we have with each other and expressing that and nurturing that and sustaining that. And this is tragically like a place that I don't think America has like intellectually or legally gone. And I also think like most of Western civilization hasn't gone there either.
So I'll try to be quicker than I've been in previous questions. But so my own view is I'm broadly speaking, just conceptually a little D-Democrat. So I think that a vision of majority rule is the foundation of any kind of legitimate government. But I think in order for individuals in a society to enjoy something like equal and effective freedom, that principles of majority rule have to be combined with a broad vision of rights, rights both negative but also frankly positive that are commonplace in constitutions around the world. So these are socioeconomic rights to labor protections, collective bargaining, health, housing, education, but then also protections for women's rights, abortion, environmental protections, indigenous safeguards, and that capacious vision of rights then suggests that any modern society is one that's marked by complexity and pluralism, and there needs to be protections that ensure that a wide variety of communities actually have their interests met in a sustainable way within the country. So that's my overarching approach. I will say that in some places globally, the rise of authoritarianism at present in recent decades is the story of durable majorities, not just one election in which a candidate doesn't even get to 50% and wins by 1.5% of the vote, at 49%, but like a durable majority behind a political leader that then uses that durable majority to reconstruct the institutions through legislative power and executive power that's fused, to overrun the courts, and then to kind of impose its will on minorities that need to be protected, as well as a host of other rights. I don't think that is the story in the US. The story in the US, and really this is a long-standing story, is instead one in which powerfully entrenched minorities, socioeconomic elites, racial elites, have been able to use the structure of our institutions to project power beyond what they would otherwise enjoy in ways that end up having really profoundly deleterious effects for that broader vision of rights and might protect certain pockets within the country on theories of pluralism or federalism, but in my view, do not protect the most marginalized or the kinds of pockets that one would imagine should be the function of a pluralist system. And indeed, even Trump's victory right now, I think we should read as part of the longue durée of how these institutions have worked. So if the institutions make it incredibly hard for majority sentiment on dominant issues to be expressed, for the country essentially to resolve ongoing social problems, then what ends up happening? The country goes through these cycles of disaffection and crisis, and that these cycles even create the potential in which you can have an individual win a very slight bare majority under conditions of profound discontent. This is like the intensity of anti-incumbent sentiment right now. So that somebody like Trump, yes, won a bare majority in this last election, but it's still the case that this is only the second time since 1988 that a Republican has won the popular vote when it comes to the presidential election, and that the nature of the institutions nonetheless have all of these forms of intensifying the power that a particular pocket enjoys. And so what does that mean for the present? To me, what it suggests is that the best way, in my view, if you care about rights infringements and if you care about like the interests of minorities that face various kinds of disenfranchisement and marginalization, is not to imagine that there's some institution that's out there, whether it's the court or somebody else that's counter-majoritarian that can solve the problem, but to instead recognize that also throughout American history, the best way to safeguard those that are most vulnerable is to meaningfully build durable majorities and to have majority electoral politics go hand in hand with rights promotion so that those rights are effectively popular rights. And it also means that one of the significant ways in which elites have entrenched their interests, socioeconomic and other racial elites, to kind of compromise the rights of those that are most marginalized, is by hollowing out the institutions that even exist outside of the electoral process that serve as a bulwark of protection. That one way to think about what's going on right now with the attack on the federal government is as an attack on labor by taking advantage, again, of a really extreme version of the employer-employee relationship to further hollow out the forms of civil society organization that can be a check or a safeguard. And so this is a moment that requires buttressing civil society organization. It doesn't mean repudiating the principle of democracy because Trump just won a bare majority. but instead recognizing that rights go hand in hand with protecting and expanding durable majorities, both inside and outside of the electoral institutions.
So I want to bring in another question, and it kind of dovetails onto what you just said, Aziz. It seems as if you're suggesting that the creation of durable majorities is a strategy to maybe answer what this question is saying. How can we get small c constitutionalism into the big C Constitution? The big C Constitution makes the Constitution very difficult to amend. Do we need to amend the Constitution, and how should we work toward that? And I would just add to that question, do we need to consider mechanisms other than amendment if the amendment process itself isn't working, right? And we can look at the history of the United States for examples where other strategies were implemented to address inconsistencies in law or interpretations of the Constitution that neglected the kinds of rights that you talked about that are important for any constitution that has moral legitimacy.
Yeah.
So I'll open it up, and then both of you could jump in.
Yeah, so I'd say that, look, it might be the case that, so this is precisely the problem, which is that various kinds of changes might require an amendment, and it's very difficult to get like Congress to act right now, let alone the kinds of terms that would be necessary to make it through the amendment process, given 2/3 in Congress, 3/4 of the states. And so it's not inconceivable that really significant changes that would in fact improve our constitutional system might require practices that don't comport entirely with the existing process. But it's very important that if there's any divergence, that it has background, genuine democratic authorization. In other words, that there's been a mass public that is mobilized, that supports those types of changes. One of the ways that we can see what's taking place right now with the extreme assertions of executive power under Article 2 that Trump and those around him are articulating is essentially an end run around legal process, but frankly, without any of the background authorization or conversation, because Trump does not embody or express something like that type of a transformative majority. And then that raises the question about how can you get democratic authorization of changes that would truly improve our constitutional system? And this is where the first thing for me to think about sometimes is not even what we think of as formal shifts to the Constitution. So yes, DC should be a state. Yes, there should be reforms to the court. Yes, we should be thinking about the nature of our amendment process. But in a way, to make any of that feasible, the first thing is to expand the institutions that would express those views, to engage in a kind of power building. That means to strengthen the kind of organic spaces in which these ideas would emerge, where they would be experienced as ideas worth extending. And that means, again, shifts in policy that would impact the position of labor, that would have impacts on housing, that would make kind of multiracial coalition building easier by effectively pursuing desegregation in schools and neighborhoods to shift the kind of cultural composition of the public. So there are a whole range of policies that are in a deep sense, we don't think of as constitutional, but should be pursued by any kind of electoral base that's interested in these larger changes. That's, of course, not even talking about voting rights reform. And this is one way, I think, broadly speaking, maybe bringing back to the story of Reconstruction, post-Reconstruction, of thinking about like what the right and the far right in particular is doing around its attacks on diversity, equity, and inclusion, on how who's within institutions of higher education, how the history is taught, is that we tend not to think of these attacks as part of the story of segregation and desegregation. But I think it's actually really important to appreciate what universities and public schools were able to generate over the course of the last 30, 40 years. In a deep sense, our universities, all their flaws, perhaps alongside the military, are two of the most thoroughly desegregated institutions in American life. They're one of the very few places where folks of different racial backgrounds not only interact, but there's a presumption that you're going to interact with people in leadership positions that come from racial minorities. And that as a separate cultural institution, as a power center outside of the purview of business or like the formations connected to the Republican Party, is a mode of civil society effectively that can help assist or pursue some of these various changes. And so it's not a surprise that it's facing attack. And indeed, I think one way to think about what some of these attacks are is an effort to like remove effectively the folks that through multiple generations are now embedded in institutions of higher education or in other kinds of institutional spaces. And in a sense, to return under new 21st century conditions to forms of segregated politics that separate communities and 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 re-entrench who's entitled to be in positions of authority. And so seeing those issues as not just like separate policy issues, but actually central, broadly speaking, to our constitutional politics is key. And recognizing that these kinds of transformations tie directly to the capacity to build durable majorities is something that has to be pursued going forward. Alongside, of course, the five-alarm fire of contesting in every way possible the ongoing assault on constitutionalism.
So just want to add on to that real quick because I agree with everything Aziz has to say, but I think the question in many ways speaks to the problem that the American left in many ways confronts as we think of it as like, what's the proper procedure to like implement all the change? But the key question is like, what's the vision? What's the philosophy that precedes the action? Reconstruction was one of those eras where they had the vision and the philosophy, and that made them capable of adapting and creating new things and taking new uh, going through new methods to create the change that they knew was necessary to create a more equitable and just society. And so it's not a question of like, do we go for constitutional amendments? Go through the Supreme Court? Do we pass legislation? It's like we have to create the philosophy, the clarity of vision first, and then implement it. And I think you can see what's happening right now, where there's so many means that they're going about their agenda that it makes people's heads spin. And the reason that they're having so many methods is because they have a clarity of their vision, which is like the founding era. The beginning of America was the best. And so therefore we're unraveling things that undermine those ideals at the beginning. And if that means we unravel it by executive order, or we have, like a billionaire go in and kind of take over the Treasury Department, and we just get rid of whole the methods that they're going are vast, but they're able to do that so quickly because they have this clarity of their philosophy. I think like happens a lot within like left-leaning progressive spaces is that they feel that there's some sort of divinity in the institutions or the bureaucracy, that the bureaucracy is good. Like the founders may be problematic. James Madison may be problematic, but the thing that he created was so divine that it could overcome his personal flaws. Therefore, we have like an allegiance to the institution. And that's our protective thing. So if we're looking for solutions, it's like, what's the proper way that we do it within this divine institution? And that undermines how we think. It also makes it really easy to negate really good ideas because if you're having an idea that's really wonderful, but doesn't adhere to the established procedures that was created, it's like, that's impossible. We can't go that route. That's bad. And it's like, this undermines critical thinking. It undermines creativity. And I think that's really what the left is struggling with a lot right now, as their, civil rights spaces are struggling right now as they try to grapple with what's happening. And so the thing that needs to happen first is a greater clarity of vision, a clarity of philosophy. I think Reconstruction helps with that. And then once that happens, then you can come up with multiple ways to going about it. And if you look at Reconstruction, you could say like the original plan wasn't to make amendments, like the original plan, there's like, oh, we abolished slavery. That's enough. Oh, They assume that the former Confederates, when they returned to Congress, would just say, "Oh, well, you guys won, so we should just listen to what the Democrats have to say, or the Republicans have to say." And that didn't happen. So then like there's a process throughout where they always are having to adapt and adjust the infrastructure so that they could implement their vision. That's why they created the Justice Department, because African Americans weren't able to exercise their rights, even though they assumed that they would be able to because those rights are granted in law. And so I think we get too bogged down with procedures and not enough on like philosophical clarity. And that's a big problem.
So we may have only time for just one more question, and I picked one that I think teases out a tension that I see emerging in this conversation, and we may not even have time to really resolve it. Um, but that is really ultimately what this conversation has been building toward. Are there, in fact, foundational principles that undergird our constitutional order that we as a society can hold fast to, right? That we've seen across history, individuals like Frederick Douglass and others have pointed toward, or is this in fact a system that is in some ways corrupted and needs to be overhauled? And the reason why I say that there's tension is that there is a spectrum of strategies that one could take to respond to questions about the failures of the Constitution. One could, as Barrett alluded to, sort of try to build power within the system by advocating for policies that support a more robust polity, housing, education, voting rights, etc. One could go in a much more radical route. And we've seen, even in the Black radical tradition, different opinions on what makes the most sense given the lived experiences. And this question, I think, is kind of speaks to that. It says, why ascribe white nationalism to 1950s Republican Party rather than to both parties? The Democratic Party blocked civil rights legislation during the 1950s, if not since the Hayes election. Wasn't cultural racism widespread in all parties, as well as similar antagonism among ethnic groups in the white population? What I hear coming out of that question is, and maybe the question I leave you with, is there hope, right? This question kind of has a sense of the whole system is rigged in a sense, or racism permeates both parties. How do we overcome these challenges? How do we maintain fidelity and hope to a constitution that seems to continuously fail us? Should we be thinking about more radical approaches, right? Do we need to write a new constitution? Do we need a kind of revolutionary moment? Do you have hope? How would you respond to a question like that?
Let me go real quick, and I'll try to be brief. But I think I've been thinking about this for a very long time, and with the language of Reconstruction and Reconstructionism, there's a key part of me that wants to ensure that people don't conflate it with destruction, where like the answer is some sort of annihilation. There's a reconstructing where you have to preserve the good parts and get rid of the bad parts and then make something new. And this creates a framework for like transcendence that can then reoccur because the new that you create then becomes the status quo. And then clearly that's not going to be perfect. So then you have to be able to do that process again and again and again and again. And you just keep on reconstructing and hopefully, through the dialectical framework, get better and better and better. And so when I think of like America at the beginning, it's really we're having a profound questions about freedom. But I think at the beginning, the emphasis has been on a notion of what I would call freedom from, where they're trying to be free from oppression, free from the British. I would also say that many colonizers wanted their freedom to be from indigenous people. They want to be free from people of color, African Americans. This is a freedom that is very irresponsible and divisive, and it's not something that's going to nurture the entire society. It is a progress from feeling that your entire society is being oppressed by some entity where like freedom has started to grow, but that grow needs to continue beyond freedom from. and go into what I consider to be called freedom with, where you're focusing on being free with other people. Like prior to this call, Aziz and Etienne and I, we all just had conversation about how we all have kids and how like two of them have got colds because of their kids. Having a cold is not something that we like. But having a house with kids that you love who then gave you a cold is something that you really appreciate because you get to be free with these runny nosed, wonderful kids. This is a freedom where, like, if you're looking at it from a freedom from, you would say that that cold is something that's like, that's taking your freedom away because you have to cancel a meeting or you got to stay home or some sort of independent, detached, alienated freedom has been impeded. But if you know that you're free with those people, that cold that you got is something that's great. It's something that you want to overcome. It's something that you don't want to have every single day, but you have it because you are lucky enough to be free with people all the time. I think this is the next step for how we start talking about freedom in the US. Where, like, when we are free with all sorts of people, there are things that we won't be able to do in some, according to some theoretical abstract, detached freedom that is like a freedom from. But we need to progress beyond this freedom from conversation into a freedom with. And so when we look at the Constitution at the beginning, I think we should look at it as a freedom from framework and that we learn from that, appreciate that we also need to make sure that we're free from oppression and free from bad things. But we then emphasize concepts of how do we be free with people? Like, what do people need to live nurturing, sustainable lives so that we can be free with them as long as possible? And this impacts stuff like education, social safety net, how we treat the elderly, how we treat the poor. All of that stuff is a freedom with conversation. So I hope, and I think Reconstruction, prior to this language existing, engaged in that process because white people wanted to be free with Black people. And that required a reconstructing, not a destruction of the Constitution, not a destruction of everything, not an annihilation, but a reconstructing where freedom with became the transition that we're having and going from freedom from to freedom with. And so that's how I see it. And I think that gives me a bit of hope because that's the dialogue, the relationship, the democracy we should strive to create.
Yeah, so um, you know, very much on the same page with Barrett's points here. So first, just to say that I really appreciate the question and the posed the clarification about the extent to which this combination of white nationalism, economic populism is the function of like both parties, and it's not just associated with the Republican Party. Indeed, the two most significant figures that I articulated or mentioned, Andrew Jackson, Wallace, these are figures of the Democratic Party. And so, to the extent that it, at various moments in time, was a large and kind of dominant political formation within mainstream white society, that's not just something that's a piece of one political party, but that did span the electoral spectrum. To the extent that I ended up highlighting the Republican Party, and that's really a function of how the party system ended up changing over the course of the 60s and the 70s, and where views associated with a particular kind of racial reaction ended up residing. But in the mid 20th century, it's absolutely a function of national elites within both the Democratic and the Republican Party that contain this element within American life. And I should also say, maybe this is a point of hopefulness, which is I think it's really important in thinking about this to appreciate the cultural and political changes wrought by the second half of the 20th century. That it is a remarkably different place at the end of the 20th century as opposed to the end of the 19th, where somebody like Teddy Roosevelt just sort of very unselfconsciously conceived of the country in racially exclusionary terms. And that will be a kind of dominant presentation where really at the end of the 20th century, the beginning of this one, that even within mainstream white society, there's the presumption that the meaning of the country is the repudiation of that kind of racial exclusion, and that the great achievements of the country, especially World War II and the Civil Rights Movement, are grounded in that repudiation. And it even has these striking effects in the present, where somebody like Steve Bannon and Elon Musk will trade accusations that the other person is the racist. So whatever you think about the substance of that disagreement, it tells you something about profound cultural changes in American life that I think have resonance today and are part of why this particular coalition or like ideological formation that has become ascendant within the politics of the Republican Party under Trump should not be understood as one that defines or dominates American politics as a whole. And then that raises the question about, well, how to then approach the Constitution. And to me, there are many figures that I think thought very seriously about these issues of strategy. One person I would just mention that I do talk about in the book is Crystal Eastman. So Crystal Eastman is a feminist, an activist in the early part of the 20th century. She's one of the original founders of the ACLU. She's very involved in the push to protect both civil liberties and labor protections during World War I. So committed to the protection of anti-war voice during a time of really intense crackdowns. And she pressed in her own thinking about constitutional politics for always operating at multiple levels. So she makes arguments during World War I about the right of labor to picket or of anti-war voices to speak out against the war based on the First Amendment, an interpretation of the First Amendment. She says, hey, this First Amendment is there in the text of the Constitution. It provides these constitutional protections. It's a ground that can be contested in the courts, that can be pursued through public conversation. But the thing that makes the First Amendment special is not that it speaks to some idealized form of constitutional government that is exclusively the province of the US, some exceptional constitutional system. It's that the US Constitution, despite its weaknesses and limitations, has a ground for a general principle that promotes dissent, self-government, speech, that should be part of any legitimate form of constitutional authority. And so you take advantage of those grounds that exist to press for safeguards against those that find themselves under threat, to push within the terms of the system for modes of interpretation that can be convincing or compelling. But at the same time, Eastman also argued that at the end of the day, the only way that the country was genuinely going to instantiate even those rights that might have a textual hook in the existing constitution was likely through fairly systematic forms of constitutional change because of the nature of who exercised power, how the institutions were arranged. And so you had to be able to operate at both levels, use the levers that exist without engaging in an undue form of veneration to press for these basic principles, and at the same time build durable political coalitions and majorities that can transform the institutions so that those principles can actually be fully instantiated. And indeed, this is one of the ways that she saw the operation of court cases, where court cases can both safeguard people from the worst forms of violence and constraint, but even when one loses in the courts, that can highlight the ways in which the system itself does not adequately provide commitments to the basic rights the text is supposed to embolden. And so you're supposed to operate at both levels, working through the existing system without falling into undue veneration, while building coalition that can pursue more systematic forms of change.
Well, we have so much to continue to talk about, but we're coming up on the end of our time. I'm so thankful to our guest speakers for their thought-provoking insights. And I just want to invite them, if they want, to share any final words before we end here. But they've been so gracious with their time, and so I'm just incredibly thankful. Any final remarks or points that you want to get across?
The last thing I would say is that we're hosting these talks once a month. And so my goal and Etienne's goal with having these and having speakers in like Aziz is to grow and develop this conversation for as long as possible. And so, look out for the next one. I also posted links where you can get my book, Aziz's book, and also other writings by myself. And so I just really appreciate everyone coming, and we'll keep on having this conversation. I was just really pleased with what we did today.
I would just say, thank you so much to Barrett and to you, Etienne, for hosting and shaping our conversation. It was really a pleasure to be part of the discussion. And thanks everybody that joined to listen.
Awesome. Well, we've had an amazing 2 hours delving into the constitutional structures that shape our society, the legacies of Reconstruction, and the powers of diverse voices in legal interpretation. I hope that all of us, as we reflect on today's discussion, we remain inspired to question, to learn, and to engage more deeply with the legal and cultural frameworks that govern our lives. Thank you all for joining us. Stay curious, stay critical, and continue the conversation beyond